Hi guys, welcome to our next video, and in this video today we're going to be talking about what test classes are and why are they required in Salesforce. So basically test classes are a special type of classes which are required when you want to push your code from your sandbox to your production instance. You have to write a test class for all of your Apex code, and the test class is used to calculate the coverage of your actual Apex class, and Salesforce recommends that you have, not recommends, but mandates that you have 75% coverage before you can push your Apex class to production. This is done from Salesforce side to make sure that our class does not interfere at all from the cloud architecture of Salesforce, and just to enforce best practices in your code. So test classes are just created like any other Apex classes as well. So again, for any references, you can go to our website and see the test classes topic in here for any code and stuff. But we're going to look at test classes in our org by continuing from a class that we created for one of our earlier sessions for the triggers. So this class was called archive helper, and this had this method, right? So as you're able to see here, it says code coverage 0% and 0 out of 9. So we have 9 coverable lines in this method, and we are gonna write a test class for this Apex class so that we are able to cover this class completely. So now, before I start writing the test class or let you guys know how to write test classes, let me open this archive helper here. Let me refresh the page. Yes, so this is the class that you're gonna cover with a test class. So now you can define test classes just like any other Apex classes. A lot of people use different naming conventions for writing test classes, but what I would recommend is you write the name of the original class that you're writing the test class for, add an underscore, and just write test here, like this. So now, once we have defined this class, in order for this to count as a test class, you need to add the @ test notation here, like this. Once you do this, now this test class will be counted as your this class will be counted as a test class, and this archive helper underscore test is not going to require any coverage because this is actually a test class. So once you have added this @ test notation here, and this Apex class is behaving like a test class, the first important thing to know is any operations or any data insertions that we do inside of this test class are not gonna be actually reflected back to the database. So you can create like 5,000 records inside of this test class, do anything, it is not gonna be reflected in your database in any way, because this is only used to cover or count towards your Apex class like this. Now, so once you have actually defined this as a test class, you need to define a test method inside it. There are two ways to define a test method. Previously, the way was to use the @istest notation with each test method, but now Salesforce has introduced a new keyword called test method, and we generally prefer to use that. So as you can see, using this test method keyword requires me to use the static keyword for this method, and I'm gonna define the method as toTest, and I'm gonna save it. So now, since I've defined test method for this method, this is actually what's gonna cover my Apex class. I'm gonna write all the logic inside of here, which is gonna cover this method right here. So basically, what we mean by covering is we want to call all the methods inside of this Apex class right here so that we're able to iterate through each and every line of code from our test class. So basically, this archive helper is receiving a list of merchandise records. And then for each of this merchandise record, it is creating the record of another object called merchandise archive. So the first thing that you would see that since we are passing a list of merchandise records here, you would want to insert some merchandise records in the database because by default, when we run a test class, this test class does not have access to your real database in your system. So even though you might have archive records already present in your org, they're not gonna be readable here in this test class. So what you have to do is you need to define records specific to this test class, which will obviously not be saved into your actual database, but any records you insert in this test class will remain visible in the context of this test class. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna define a new merchandise record like this, give it a name, let's say merch, and give it a type because we have a type field on the merchandise object. Just gonna name it as type and then we insert this. Once we do this, as soon as we run this method, it is gonna insert this new merchandise record. And then what we can do is we can actually call this archive helper class here and call the method archive here. And then inside of this, I'm gonna create a new list of the merchandise type mlist equal to new list merchandise like this. And then inside of this mlist, I'm gonna add the record that I just created above. So this will give me a list of merchandise records. And in here you can see we have to pass a list of merchandise records as a parameter. Then we can pass this list to this archive method here and save it. Now, this completes or like this will actually complete all the use cases that we have for the test class. But before we go into that, we want to look at some other things too. So test classes have certain methods available to them exclusively, and those can be accessed by using the test and dot keyword since test is a standard class. So there are two methods. One of them is called test.start test, and the second one is called test.stop test. So it is a best practice. So like I'm gonna move this outside as well. So whatever code we are actually covering or trying to cover, so we are basically trying to cover the archive method of the archive helper class. We need to keep that method call inside of the test.start test and test.stop test. But basically what these do is, so let's say you are doing a DML here, you're inserting a merchandise record right here, right? So what start test does is it resets all the limitations or limits that you have. So like you have a limit of 150 DMLs or sorry 100 DMLs that you can do in a single transaction. So this DML right here used up one of those transaction limits, right? Now after you insert a single merchandise, you have just 99 DMLs left now in this transaction. But if you call test.start test, this will reset those limits. And after this test.start test, all your limits will be reset and you again have all 100 DMLs available. And similarly, test.stop test, what it does is, if you call any asynchronous piece of code right here, this method, if this was maybe a future method or anything, if you call any asynchronous piece of method here, test.stop test will actually call that method in a synchronous form just because of the test class. That way, it allows for us to test asynchronous pieces of code too. So, as a best practice, you can use start test and stop test right here to do this. Now, another best practice in test classes is using system.asserts. Assert or assert equals method, but typically system.assert allows you to confirm that your method behaved in the correct way. So let's, for example, we are passing a single record of the merchandise object into this method from our test class. This method should create a single merchandise archive record as well. So what we'll actually do or use in the assert is after your method has run here, you're going to query all the merchandise archive records that are in the system, because once this method is run, our system in the current test class should have a single merchandise archive record created for this particular merchandise, because that's what the method does. So we pass this single merchandise record into this method. This method will create, or as you can, if I go to the main class, it is defining a new merchandise archive, and then it is creating another merchandise archive record. So we're gonna actually query again to see if that merchandise archive record has been inserted to the database or not. And the way we check that is we query all of these records, and then we put in the assert if this list that we just defined here is empty or not. So if this list that we defined here is not empty like this, that means that the archive record was successfully created and our test class should be able to cover all of this method directly. So again, to reiterate, I'm just going to recap all of this. This would be a lot to take together, guys, but bear with me. What we did was, if I look in this class is just expecting a list of merchandise records as an input. And then for how many records it receives, it creates merchandise archives for all of those records. When we have to cover this class in the test class, the first thing we have to do is we have to insert a new merchandise record. Then we add this merchandise record to a list, and then we pass this list to the method that we're trying to cover, the archive method. Then once this method has finished running, we again query merchandise archive records. This query will only return records which are created in the context of this test class. Since we only had one merchandise record which was passed to this archive method, we would only receive one method in this merchandise archive list. And then in the assert, we are checking if this list is empty or not. So what this makes sure is in the future, for some reason, if this method does not create a merchandise archive record, this assert will fail and your test will not pass. But now once we have set up all this code right here, you'll see that there is a run test button right here. So if I click on this, this will actually run this test class. So you see, after I have run this under the tests tab, you can see that our method ran successfully. So now I can go back here and then see a code coverage tab in here. So I can click on this, and as you can see, it says that we have 100% coverage, and it shows me which test class and what method I use for this 100% coverage. So now all of this has been covered properly through this test class. So let me show you guys, if I reverse the assert location just for testing and I run the test again, so you'll see that my test fails and it actually says that the assertion failed. That is why you have to be careful with using asserts, because this will not actually allow you to run the class unless your assert is true, follows your defined philosophy or output. So again, we're going to run it one more time. And yeah, as you see, the third test also ran fine. And then you'll see 100% coverage. Now, a lot of other things as well that you want to cover in test classes. So as I said that your actual real data is not available in test classes, and there is an exception to that rule if you use a notation called C all data equals to true in here like this. Now, if I use this, what happens is that the test class has access to the real database. I mean, if I have merchandise records already created in the system, if I query on those records, they'll actually get the real merchandise records that are saved in my database. But this only provides read access from the database. If I insert one more new merchandise from the test class, this will not be inserted to my actual real database. So CL data true only provides you read access to the data real database in your system. So what is the use case of using CL data is like, so I mean, for this example, I had to create a new merchandise record and I was able to do that by writing this piece of code. But there could be certain scenarios where you don't have the ability to insert the entity that you want to get. Or in other words, let's say if this merchandise object was not insertable with Apex code for some reason. So in that scenario, you would need to read from the actual database. Then you would see or set this CL data as true. But generally, it is not a best practice to use this unless it is absolutely required. So don't use this. Now, the second thing is that we wanted to go through that there is another method here called a test setup method, which is defined as @test setup void. I think I have to do the static as well in the method name. What this is used for is like right now we only had a single test method in our org or in this particular test class. So let's say instead of having this test method 1, I would have like a test method 2 as well with some other scenario. So basically, since I need this merchandise record in all of my test methods, I can instead copy this here and insert this in the test setup method. So the test setup method actually runs first when you run the test class, and then any data inserted inside the test setup method is actually visible in all the test methods that run afterwards. So now instead of like defining the merchandise again here, I can delete this from here and I can just query this data from my list like this, whatever data I want, and like this. And then I can do the same thing in my first test method like this. I don't define the merchandise here. So what essentially happened here was I defined the merchandise record in the test setup, and once the test setup is finished, I can just now query this record in my test method. This record will be visible here because the test setup is what runs first, and then this record would be available for this test method and for this test method. Now, one more thing, guys, that you might not like understand or know is that test methods all run independently. They're not dependent on each other. So this merchandise record, let's say, was inserted in the test setup method and it was passed to the first test method, this to test 1. If I make any changes to this merchandise record from this method, that change is not gonna be reflected in the test method. So basically, this, once it is inserted, when I access this merchandise record in the test setup or in the do test 1 method, this will give me the merchandise record defined here, right? Then when the test method to this do test two method runs, this will also give me a fresh record from the test setup. So any changes I do in this record in this first test method is not going to be reflected back in the second one. So again, test setup is just a way to like combine all your data creation so that all of your data is commonly available in all your test methods. Basically, that way you can improve the efficiency of your test classes. So this was it, guys, for the really simple beginner guide on test classes. Again, you have to do different things when you want to write test classes for, let's say, batch classes or triggers. But basically, all you need to do is just figure out the entry point. So let's say if this was being called from an account trigger, all you would have to do here is insert a new account so that the trigger gets called and your code gets called. Again, in the case of your batch classes, all you have to do is just execute the batch class inside of the test methods so that it runs your batch class and covers all the appropriate things. So basically, all you need to do is just run as much as code you can in your methods by calling these methods in your test classes. That should cover all of your things. So I hope you guys understood this. This was a beginner guide on test classes, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.